Am I the asshole for not paying my stepdaughter's tuition fee? I never tried to replace her mother. That is probably the most important part of this entire story. Because somehow, despite spending almost 10 years carefully staying in my lane, I still ended up becoming the villain in her eyes the second money entered the conversation. And honestly, what hurts the most is not even the money itself. It is realizing that after all these years, the first time my stepdaughter ever treated me warmly was when she thought I was about to hand her a massive check. I am 48 years old. My husband is 51. He has a daughter from his first marriage named Chloe. She is 22 now. When I met my husband, Chloe was still a teenager, old enough to make her own opinions very clear. And from the beginning, she wanted absolutely nothing to do with me. Not aggressively at first. Just cold, polite enough that nobody could call her rude, but distant enough that you always felt the wall. If I tried talking to her at dinner, she answered with one-word responses. If I bought her birthday gifts, she thanked me politely and moved on. If I offered to help with something, she usually said, "I'm fine." So very early on, I made a decision. I would not force the relationship. I would not try to become her replacement mother. I would not overstep, because I had seen too many blended families implode from step-parents trying too hard, so I stayed respectful. I attended her graduations. I bought Christmas gifts. I helped financially when emergencies came up, but emotionally, I kept a careful distance because that was clearly what she wanted. And honestly, over time, we settled into something peaceful, not close, not warm, but manageable. Then graduate school happened, and suddenly everything exploded. For context, my husband had been saving money for Chloe's education for years. Not unlimited money, a reasonable amount, enough to cover a good local university and help her start life without drowning in debt. And for years, that was supposedly the plan. Local school, reasonable tuition, manageable costs. Then apparently, without really discussing it with anyone, Chloe applied to a private out-of-state university, an extremely expensive one. The kind where the tuition alone made my stomach hurt when I saw the number, and the worst part, she got accepted. At first, everybody was excited. My husband was proud. I was proud for her too. Because regardless of our relationship, getting accepted into a competitive graduate program is impressive. Then reality hit. The tuition was almost double what my husband had saved, and suddenly every conversation in our house became about money. At first, my husband tried to stay optimistic. He talked about scholarships, loans, payment plans, assistantships, but little by little, I could see the stress eating him alive. He started staying up late staring at spreadsheets on his laptop. He stopped sleeping properly. One night, I walked into the kitchen around 1 in the morning and found him sitting there in complete darkness, just rubbing his forehead. I asked if he was okay, and he looked at me and quietly said, "I don't know how to tell her no." That sentence honestly broke my heart a little, because I knew exactly what he meant. This was not really about school anymore. It was about guilt. His divorce from Chloe's mother had been ugly years ago, and even though Chloe never openly blamed him for it, I think my husband spent years trying to compensate emotionally. Every achievement, every milestone, every opportunity. He felt responsible for making sure she never felt deprived because of the divorce. And now suddenly he could not give her what she wanted. A few days later, he approached me about the tuition gap, very carefully, almost nervously. Now, this next part is important. I have inheritance money from my parents, quite a bit of it. But from the very beginning of our marriage, we agreed to keep that money separate. Not because we did not trust each other, because my parents specifically left it to me, and we mutually agreed it would eventually go toward buying a home together later in life. That money represented security to me, stability, a future, and my husband always respected that. Until now, he asked if I would consider helping cover Chloe's tuition difference. Not demanding, not angry. Honestly, he sounded embarrassed even asking. I told him the truth. I said I was uncomfortable using my inheritance this way, especially because graduate school was not an emergency. There were other schools, other options, loans, part-time programs. I also pointed out that Chloe never discussed any of this beforehand. She simply applied and expected it to work out somehow. My husband got quiet after that, not hostile, just defeated, and I felt awful. So I told him I would think about it. That was my mistake. Because apparently somewhere along the line that turned into, she's paying for it. To this day, I still do not know exactly what happened, but I suspect my husband vented to his sister about the situation. And his sister, my sister-in-law Diane, has always had a terrible habit of inserting herself into things. 2 days later, my phone rang. I looked down and saw Chloe's name. which immediately surprised me because Chloe almost never called me directly. Ever. I answered thinking maybe something was wrong, and instantly I noticed her tone was different. Warm, like genuinely warm. She sounded happier talking to me than she had in years. She thanked me repeatedly, said she really appreciated what I was doing for her future. At first, I honestly thought maybe my husband had already talked to her and they figured out some financial plan together. Then she said, "I know this is a huge sacrifice and I'll never forget it." And my stomach dropped, because suddenly I realized exactly what had happened. I interrupted her and said, "Chloe, what are you talking about?" There was this awkward pause. Then she said, "Diane told me you agreed to cover the tuition difference." I literally closed my eyes, because I immediately knew this conversation was about to become a disaster. I told her there had been a misunderstanding, that I had not agreed to pay anything. And the silence on the other end of the phone changed instantly. It was honestly one of the fastest emotional shifts I have ever experienced. 1 second she sounded warm and grateful. The next second it felt like ice. Then she said, "Oh, just, oh," and somehow that one word carried more hostility than yelling would have. I tried explaining that I had only agreed to think about it, but before I could even finish, she snapped. She said, "I knew it." I remember sitting there confused asking, "Knew what?" And then years of resentment apparently came pouring out all at once. She said she always knew I never cared about her future, that I hoarded money while pretending to support the family, that I only cared about controlling things. Then she accused me of enjoying watching my husband struggle. At that point, I was honestly speechless, because this girl barely acknowledged my existence for years unless basic politeness required it. And suddenly she was talking to me like I had personally ruined her life. I tried staying calm at first. I told her graduate school is not automatically somebody else's financial responsibility, especially not mine. And that was when she really exploded. She said, "You have the money, you just don't want to help." Which honestly told me everything. Not, "You can't." Not, "You're unable." Just, "You don't want to," as if having money automatically obligated me to hand it over. I finally lost patience. I told her she was acting entitled. The second that word left my mouth, she completely lost it. She started crying and yelling at the same time, saying she always knew I hated her, that I treated her differently because she was not really mine, and honestly, that hurt, because despite our distance, I genuinely tried for years to respect her boundaries. I never forced affection, never competed with her mother, never inserted myself. I thought giving her space was respecting her. But apparently in her mind, my distance became proof that I never cared. The call ended horribly. And afterward, I just sat there staring at my phone, feeling completely drained. Then my husband came home, and immediately I could tell Chloe had already spoken to him. He looked exhausted, not angry, not surprised, just exhausted. I explained exactly what happened. How Diane apparently told Chloe I was paying, how Chloe called me, how the conversation spiraled. My husband rubbed his face and just quietly said, "Diane should have stayed out of it." Which was true. But honestly, by then the damage was already done. Then came the silence, and somehow the silence was worse than yelling, because my husband kept insisting he understood my decision, but he also stopped talking about the future house, stopped bringing up finances, stopped mentioning Chloe entirely, and I started feeling this horrible pressure building in the house, like everybody was waiting for me to cave. A few days later, Diane called me directly, and instead of apologizing, she actually sounded annoyed with me. She said, "You could have just helped her. You have the money." That sentence made me angrier than I expected, because I am so tired of people volunteering other people's money like it means nothing. I asked Diane if she planned on contributing. She immediately got defensive and said, "That's different." Of course it was. It always is when it is somebody else's bank account. Then she said something that genuinely stuck with me. She said, "Do you really want Chloe remembering you this way?" And honestly, that sentence bothered me for days, because part of me wondered if this was bigger than money. Was this one of those moments that permanently defines a family relationship? Would helping her finally create some connection between us? Or would it simply teach everyone that emotional pressure works on me? The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Because if Chloe had approached me differently from the beginning, if she had treated me warmly before money entered the picture, if she had included me in the conversation instead of assuming access to my inheritance, I honestly might have considered helping. Not necessarily the full amount, but something. Instead, the first real emotional warmth she ever showed me vanished the second she realized there was no check coming. And I cannot stop thinking about that. Now my husband barely talks about the situation anymore. Chloe is not speaking to me. Diane thinks I am selfish, and somehow I became the villain because I refused to spend inheritance money on an adult woman who never viewed me as family until she needed funding. I genuinely do feel bad for Chloe. I understand wanting opportunities. I understand disappointment. But I also cannot shake the feeling that everybody around me expects me to sacrifice years of financial security simply to avoid being disliked. And honestly, I do not know if giving in now would solve anything, or just teach everybody that my boundaries disappear the moment enough guilt gets applied. So now I am stuck wondering, am I actually being heartless here? Or am I finally noticing a pattern I should have stopped enabling years ago?